alarming potential of 5G technology, what the TikTok controversy and the backlash against Huawei reveal about US China relations, the changing politics around big tech. Broadly, these are the headline themes for this edition of Times Square, a series of fireside chats with some of the finest minds in the business of cybersecurity. This is part of our Sci-Fi 2020 programming. With that, a warm welcome both to our audience and our special guest, Dr. James Andrew Lewis. He prefers to be called Jim, so Jim is the director of the Technology Policy Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. His writings include the best-selling Cybersecurity for the 44th Presidency, cited by President Obama in the first speech by a US president on cybersecurity. Jim, thank you for making the time.
Thank you. And I remind you that Niels Bohr, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1922, said, "An expert is a person who's made all possible mistakes in a very narrow field." So I am an expert in that sense.
Yeah, and I said fine mind exactly for that
Oh,
reason. So, Jim, building safeguards into the system seems like a very obvious and necessary goal. But the question I will put to you first is this: how much strategy, how much market for all the pipes through which the world now connects?
so this is, as many have noted, the most complex system that mankind has ever built. There's tens of millions of devices running hundreds of millions of lines of code. It's very difficult to get your hands around this thing. And so one of the things we want to think about is that when you look at previous networks, they usually weren't the result of strategy, whether it was the telegraph or electricity or it was driven mainly by market forces, right? And so we want to think, how do we harness the power of the market to push for better security? We haven't done that as well as we could, but I think strategy, some capitals like Washington are obsessed with having strategies. It's not clear to me they actually make any difference, right? If we didn't have a 5G strategy, what would be different? Don't know. So that's, why don't I stop there?
So, since you mentioned 5G, let's start
I
there.
shouldn't try and think and talk at the same time.
Since you mentioned 5G, let's get into those specifics. We've seen dramatic escalation this summer, and you've often said discussions of a 5G race can focus on the wrong metrics. What are the right ones and why? And within that, I want you to talk about the core and the edge.
Yeah, ultimately, the right metric is income, GDP, revenue, because 5G will be a new layer of network, a new set of connections. It's what rides on them that makes money, that provides advantage, that will make the difference. So if 4G was the app economy, but it was apps like, Angry Birds and parking apps, 5G will be the industrial app economy. It'll be smart cars, smart hospitals, smart factories. 5G will enable a broad range of services, most of which haven't been built. So it's very difficult to say ahead, behind, when you're looking at people who are basically building the superhighways on which cars and trucks will drive. But right now, not too many cars and trucks. Follow the money is always good advice. And in this case, number of patents or number of cell towers or number of cell phones, it doesn't tell you anything. Are people making money off 5G? And if the answer is yes, then we have a good way to measure success.
Okay, we will quickly move to TikTok because we must. So at first glance, the Trump admin's decision to ban TikTok and Wechat seemed to have that look of hard-nosed diplomacy. But within days, it unraveled. And then came this curious date of November 12th. And then the chatter about TikTok seeding this idea in the White House of the president's supporters posting actively. Put all that in context for us, given that the source code remains elsewhere.
The key thing in understanding TikTok is that Americans have had it with China. They're fed up with China. There's so many examples of Chinese espionage and Chinese cheating on promises. Hong Kong, a solemn promise one country, two states, gone. And so Americans have had it with China. They don't trust China. And then you look at one of the most popular social apps in the world, and people say, could it be used for espionage or influence? Now, to be fair, TikTok is perfectly harmless, right? There's no evidence that something bad has happened. I think I use TikTok myself, but um, you know, it's not TikTok that's the problem. It's its owner, ByteDance in Beijing. The US and the rest of the world should know that China passed a law some years ago that mandates that any company must cooperate with the security apparatus in collecting intelligence, should they be instructed to do so. There's no appeal, right? So people say, how do we know that one day Beijing wouldn't show up at ByteDance's headquarters and say, do us a favor, right? And because the connection is one that most people don't see. You've turned on the automatic updater on your apps on your phone, right? That's good. But you have no idea what's in those updates. And if the Chinese wanted, they could put something in the TikTok update, right? TikTok wouldn't even know. And then you would have this ability to, one, put malware or spyware on the phones of millions of Americans. That's concern one. Concern two is China will use TikTok as a vehicle for its influence operations. And we've seen an uptick in those. It's not very good. I mean, Xi Jinping lip syncing isn't going to persuade many Americans. But Chinese censorship, where they block people in Hong Kong from using TikTok, that's a concern. So espionage, influence operations. This administration is a little more spontaneous and ad hoc than any other administration. And that means that the model for understanding their actions on TikTok might be more like the real estate market in New York rather than the traditional realm of diplomacy. But they have reasonable goals. They've pursued them in a somewhat erratic fashion. But the foundation of this is that nobody trusts China, and nobody should trust China.
You've said you have to be either delusional or really mad at quote El Presidente to believe you can use WeChat without being surveilled by the Chinese. Then with the source code with ByteDance, nothing really changes, right?
And the two are different. So ByteDance is a company that developed and owns the algorithm
Hmm.
that queues up what you see on TikTok. You don't get a choice. The algorithm
Correct.
decides this is what you're interested in. It's amazingly successful. So 50 million Americans spend more than an hour a day on TikTok. Um, you could use it to, if you chose, perhaps to control content. No evidence of that. You could use the updates that would go from ByteDance to TikTok as a vehicle for spyware. WeChat's different. WeChat is a social media platform. It's located in China, and people use it to communicate. So when you communicate, your text message or whatever goes back to China to an institution or an installation where the Chinese state has surveillance now, right? So TikTok, hypothetical risk, WeChat. Is there anyone who really believes they can use WeChat without being surveilled by China if it chose to do so? If so, I have some real estate for them in New Jersey they might be interested in.
Yeah, so pressure tactics. You say that the way this used to work was you'd send a draft of the commerce order banning TikTok or whatever to ByteDance
Mhm,
lawyers and say, we publish this if there isn't a deal by dot dot dot. Uh,
mhm.
how have things changed? And I know you've participated in at least 8 major negotiations with China since 1992 on security, tech, trade. Um, how does it work inside the room?
This administration is a lot more impulsive, a lot more ad hoc than any other administration in the 20th century, right? And so it means that some of the old, more smoother techniques for exercising influence have gone by the wayside. Uh, that's just how this presidency works. So if you were looking for a model, I would probably look more at big real estate deals in New York. You know, the posturing, the public statements, the arbitrary timelines, the threats. That's how some people in New York do business. It's not how we do business in Washington. It's not how we do business in other places, but that's the model here, right? It's a very personalized model. It's a very spontaneous model. And we'll see at the end of the day, I think it will end up at the same place, but it's been a much more dramatic series of twists and turns than we would normally have expected.
You were recently on a Chinese news show with two researchers from the Chinese Academy of the Sciences. The topic was tech competition, and their view was it would take at least like 10 years for China to catch up. And you said that you were frank and they'll probably never invite you back. What did you say?
Well, the first thing that's interesting is in private, the Chinese researcher said 10 to 15 years for them. That was how far behind China is. So much of what you see coming out of China is propaganda. What a surprise, right? What I said was things are going to get worse, they're not going to get better. That you can't make announcements that you're going to displace the US, that you're going to put China at the center of the world stage and have a China centric world, right? And do that on the basis of stealing technology. Why would you think we would be friends? So I think things will get worse. And that's probably true under a Biden administration, should Biden happen to win, as much as a Trump administration is. Americans are kind of fed up with China and what it's been doing. I don't see how the Chinese can change, though, and that's what is unpopular. Xi Jinping has to do things to preserve one party rule. And some of that is continued economic growth through economic espionage. Some of that is take two. Some of that is these very nationalistic assertions about China's central place. And in some days, it looks like the Chinese want to go back to the old tributary system they had in the empires. I don't think the rest of the world is ready for that, and it guarantees continued disputes. The other thing that's interesting is if this was just the US, you could say, well, that's the Americans, they're being crazy again. And you could probably make a good case. But you see India having concerns. You see growing concerns in Europe, Japan, Australia. Countries are concerned by China's behavior. And that's going to make it difficult, if not impossible, for China to achieve what it wants. I'm not sure I'd want to live in a world where I had to read Xi Jinping thought every morning.
So, since you mentioned tributaries, I'd like to just stick with that thought for a minute more. US has a long history of creating networks, just like any other country. Um, but given the situation now, you've been saying that it's the EU, not the US, which is driving privacy policy, and but still complaining that GDPR isn't nice to tech giants, isn't persuasive. So then, what is?
This is, I think, one of the core issues for the next administration, whether it's Trump or Biden, in that to get the Chinese to change their behavior, it's not a Cold War. It's not going to be encirclement or containment. Those are the 20th century. But you will need partnerships. We have partnerships with Japan. We have partnerships with Australia. But you need the European Union, and in particular, you need Berlin, right? So going to China and saying, look, all of us, all of the developed economies agree, your behavior is inappropriate. You have to change. That would be persuasive. Persuasive over a number of years, because it could be bad for Xi Jinping's political future if he's seen as caving to Western pressure, right? A much tougher fight than it was, say, 10 years ago. But I think we need the Europeans on board. And what that means is a couple things. The easy one is we need to come to some sort of common understanding on privacy. The Europeans care very much about privacy, and the US has a very lax privacy system. surely there's room for compromise there. The more difficult one is many Europeans are still concerned, wrongly, I would say, but they're still concerned about your US intelligence activities in Europe. One of the things that doesn't usually come out is those are all done in cooperation with European intelligence agencies. It's not like we're tromping around spying on the French. It's that we're working with the French government to monitor terrorism, monitor Russian espionage, right? But we may have to be more open. We may have to agree to some constraints. You probably remember that Angela Merkel asked for a no spy deal. We may have to think of what does that look like? It's not going to be hands off forever on everything, right? But there are probably areas where we need to think, how do we reassure our European partners that the espionage we engage in is done cooperatively and for shared common goals? Now, that one, I'll tell you, is really unpopular in the US, but we might be able to avoid having to make those concessions if we do enough on privacy. So there's a balance here. Make the Europeans happy on GDPR. Maybe they'll forget about Snowden.
Um,
Snowden who?
yeah, yeah, okay. Maybe just some closing thoughts on this theme. Based on all that you said, cyber weapons don't have to be cutting edge to lacerate a community or a company or a country, but they level the battlefield very well, even if they're rough on the edges.
Mm.
Um, for the audience who's watching this, um, wherever, um, what what have you learned over the years, and what should they take away from this?
So I started working on these cyber issues probably about 20 years ago, but I worked on military strategy. That's really inappropriate. I worked on strategy more than that. And one thing I learned is countries are tougher than they look if they have decent political leadership. Right? And so the idea that you're going to have a cyber attack and people will collapse in terror, we recognize this movie because it was the belief in the 1930s that aerial bombardment would speedily produce victory. So you had all these predictions about World War II would be over in a month because whomever, usually the British, would be unable to withstand the hail of bombs. And bad news, it's not how it works. We found one of my readers in university was a member of the Strategic Bombing Survey, which the US conducted at the end of World War II. And what he found is dropping bombs on people generally makes them mad. Surprise. And actually, economic performance went up, right? People adjust. So, what I've learned is societies, if they are well led, are resilient, they're resourceful, they will withstand cyber attack. We don't want to overestimate the effect. We don't want to say that it can defeat us. Now, there is a problem here, and I think you're seeing discussions in the UN looking at, well, the old strategic approach to cybersecurity may not be appropriate anymore. We should do something more like the Small Arms Treaty, where countries agree to control small arms, because cyber, they argue, is more like a small arm than a strategic weapon. There's some truth to that, but I think what I've learned is don't overestimate the effectiveness of your weapon and don't give up.
We've got now like about um, a, a bunch of takeaways, and I'm just going to play it back to you and for the audience in case they're meeting us like at the end of this
Right.
podcast. So basically, to the bigger question about how much strategy and how much what was that first question?
Market.
Yeah, so to that question about how much strategy and how much market, your view is basically your ultimate metric would be wealth creation, national income. That would be a barometer. On 5G, you're going towards edge and core security rather than this or that generally. TikTok, lip syncing videos, 1 minute, 15 seconds, whatever is not the issue. It's the connections with Beijing and the source code. America generally fed up with China, and the view is the challenge should for the next administration, whichever it is to get the Chinese to change their behavior, change, make the Europeans happy with GDPR so they forget some of the other stuff. And overall, if societies are well led, um, they will be resilient, whether it's cyber attack or any other kind of thing. Do you think I've kind of captured more or less most of that stuff?
I think that's right. You've done a great job. So, we are entering a new political and social environment caused by the internet, and we are at an early stage of how it will change things, but it's manageable. The idea that this is out of our control, it's difficult to control. It moves very quickly, but this is something that governments and their societies can deal with and use to their advantage.